Hello, and welcome to the Sustainability Leaders Podcast, part of the Jobs with Impact compendium of resources for people who want to make a positive impact on the world. I'm David Rosenheim, your host. Every week, we bring you in-depth conversations with people who are leading the way to a sustainable future. I hope these conversations will be as inspiring to you as they are to me, and most of all, I hope that they'll empower you to take action. The planet needs you. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to jobswithimpact.com. Hi, everyone. This week's guest is Gero, Chief Sustainability Officer for the County of Los Angeles. Gary and I have a shared history of sorts in that he was the long-running president of the Climate Action Reserve during my tenure as Executive Director of the Climate Registry. The Reserve and the Registry are sister organizations, both originating in the California Climate Action Registry and both playing key roles in the development of carbon accounting standards across the country and throughout the world. Gary served as a mentor to me as I stepped into my role at the Climate Registry, and I remember fondly our monthly lunches in Los Angeles, where we would compare notes on everything from board management to personnel challenges to new developments in climate policy coming from Washington and Sacramento. We also co-led several delegations of CEOs, governors, and others to the annual COP, or UN, climate conferences, the pinnacle of which was the joint TCR-CAR delegation to Paris for COP21 and the signing of the Paris Agreement. I've always been impressed by Gary's integrity, his technical acuity, and grit in the climate struggle. He's been a critical player in California's role at the vanguard of climate policy, and has been at the center of the development of the North American carbon market. Gero has a long career in energy and environmental policy and organizational leadership, from early days at LADWP, where he oversaw renewable and energy efficiency programs for the city of Los Angeles, to leading the Climate Action Reserve, to his current role overseeing the sustainability for the County of Los Angeles, which includes nearly 90 cities. I really enjoyed catching up with Gary, and I think you'll enjoy getting to know him and his work. Gary, thanks again for joining me here. I want to first talk a little bit about your motivation for doing the work that you do. You've been in this field for a number of years. What drives it? Why are you doing the work that you do?
Yeah, well, this is in some ways I am a product, if you will, of my environment, and I don't mean that to be a pun, but I grew up in Los Angeles in the 1960s and early 70s, and so I'm old enough to remember the days when Los Angeles was shrouded in pollution. When you couldn't see to the end of the block because the smog was so heavy, it looked worse than fog, and days when just breathing hurt, not exercising, but literally just taking a breath hurt. And we were in school. We were kept in the classroom during recess and lunch and all of that because it was considered too dangerous to go outside. And so, of course, that marks you in a certain way. But I'm also old enough to remember the first Earth Day, and it was 1970, and I was moved by the idea of the Earth and the need to protect it. Of course, I was living in an awful part of it at that point. But I was. This is a little bit perhaps off topic, but I was a newspaper boy when such things still existed, and and I saw, in folding my newspapers ready to take them out on delivery, I saw those first images of Earth from space, and that sort of beautiful blue planet sort of hanging in the ether. And of course, I was young and impressionable, and but it always struck with me sort of the confluence of those things, and I was always an environmentalist. When I was a kid doodling, what I would doodle was the word Earth and draw pictures of the planet. And while I took a somewhat non-traditional path to the career I eventually entered, it wasn't because I wasn't interested in earth sciences or ecology. There was no such thing as sustainability programs at that time when I was in college. But I studied political economy, and because I really wanted to understand how things worked, how the systems worked from a political and economic standpoint. But when I finally entered into my career, I knew that I wanted to work in the environment, and that was going to be a core goal and focus of mine for my entire career, despite not having a traditional environmental background or education.
And I want to talk more about that, but I just want to circle back to this LA of the early 70s. And it's not an LA that I ever witnessed, but I was in Delhi a few months ago on a really, really bad period for smog. I think it's always pretty bad there, but as you were saying, I mean, you couldn't see halfway down the block, and that's happening now. And LA's cleaned up quite a bit. I mean, can you talk a little bit? I don't want to jump too far forward about kind of what went into that and what other cities around the world, these mega cities, might learn from LA's experience.
Yeah, absolutely. It took a concerted effort, of course, and laws helped. 1970 was also the Clean Air Act, or technically Clean Air Act amendments, but it was really a refashioning of the Clean Air Act, which gave some regulatory teeth. And out of that came a whole host of initiatives here in Los Angeles, but also throughout California. California has always been a leader, and even so back then. But it started really, and it's kind of full circle in a way for me because I'm now working in the county of Los Angeles. It started with the county board of supervisors simply outlawing things like the backyard incineration of garbage. We looked at, we as in the government looked at what were the sources of air pollution and how can we start to attack them. And of course, they were myriad. And so, like any problem, you have to break it into its component parts and attack each part individually. But it was the county board of supervisors that started the cleaning of the air revolution. And I don't think they knew what they were doing in sort of a long-term goal, but they knew that backyard incineration of garbage was not a good idea. Although I can tell you that again, growing up here, there were many houses that those backyard incinerators still existed and served as planters or other decorative features in in the backyard. But that really led to the formation of the Los Angeles Air Pollution Control District, ultimately leading to the creation of the South Coast Air Quality Management District, and really looking at all of the component parts of air pollution. LA was also the source of a lot of the academic research at Riverside, UCLA, and elsewhere. And so we knew, of course, cars were a major problem, factories were a major problem. There's the obvious things, but there's the less obvious things too, like paints and thinners and those kinds of chemicals, which don't, when they don't emit smoke, so you don't think of it, but those fumes form in the atmosphere with oxides of nitrogen of nitrogen to create ozone, and so it really was a long-term coordinated campaign. And I'd say one of the biggest pieces is the state of California's authority under the Clean Air Act to enact its own motor vehicle standards, because cars today are literally 99% cleaner than they were, a generation or two ago. And it started with the requirement for catalytic converters, but every aspect of motor vehicle technology has gotten cleaner to the point where we still get pollution from motor vehicles because we have so damn many of them in Los Angeles and in across the world, but they're not the source of our most significant source of air pollution. It's the sources that we can't regulate as Californians, what are called the federal sources, the trains and the locomotives and the ships and the aircraft. Only the federal government can regulate those, and they've never been in any hurry to do it, whatever the administration has been.
Going back to the LA of your childhood, you're running a paper route. Was it the LA Times?
No, it was the Los Angeles Herald Examiner.
Is that still around?
It is not, sadly. Like most big cities, there was a time when they could have 2 or even 3 newspapers, and it's all now consolidated.
Well, what was the culture that engendered the change, right? You mentioned so many different sources of pollution, so many different contributors to the horrible smog problem. I mean, were people rising up? Were they up in arms? What did it take kind of for the culture of Los Angeles to reach a tipping point, I guess, so that action could take place?
Yeah, it did, and I think this is what is instructive for the mega cities of the world that are out there and still wrestling with this. And I know in China they certainly get this point, which is that kind of pollution that people live with on a daily basis leads or can lead to social unrest. And the Chinese are particularly sensitive to wanting to ensure a harmonious society. That's part of that's part of the culture, and so there's a strong concern in China that air pollution could lead to social unrest, and they want to avoid that at all costs. So they've been very aggressive, and Beijing is working towards cleaning up, as are the other cities in China. And they've been spending a lot of time in California learning the California lessons. But I think so. Certainly, Los Angeles, we did see some unrest, and there were a couple of sort of key episodes where you literally had such bad air pollution days that people were dying from respiratory illness, and that simply couldn't stand any longer, and that's what really spurred action when you have those kinds of severe episodes. And I think this is instructive for the cities of India and the other growing mega cities across the world. Is there will come a time, if it's not already there, where the people won't tolerate it any longer. They know that it's a problem that can be solved. They're intellectually understand that other places have tackled this problem successfully, and they wonder why it's not happening in their own cities, and they will rise up. I think Mexico City is a great example. Mexico City was notorious, of course, as a capital of air pollution. That you couldn't breathe there. And they have largely cleaned that city up. The air pollution problem is worse than it is here in Los Angeles still, but it's a whole lot better, largely because they've tackled it in the same way that California has tackled the problem here.
I guess with smog and other forms of particulate pollution, you have kind of the benefit that it affects people directly. And with climate change, the problem is less visible. It's less noticeable. Obviously, some of these sources of pollution contribute both to climate change as well as to some of these health hazards with air pollution. But that's sort of a problem, right? In our fight to mitigate climate change, is that it's not as palpable an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is part of the reason that we haven't seen the kind of action outside of California that you might expect. And there's a there's sort of a term for this, and I think the environmental justice community has created the term, which is slow violence. Our communities are suffering from the slow violence that comes from climate change, and environmental justice communities coined the term because they were suffering from the slow violence that came from just air pollution in general, which is not the same kind of violence that you have on the streets with guns and gangs and such. But that's exactly it. We as a species, I think, are not particularly well suited to reacting to longer term amorphous dangers. We're still in some ways scared animals in the forest, and when we hear a sound nearby, that's what triggers our attention. If we hear something off in the distance, it's like, oh yeah, there's something off in the distance, and I'm not too afraid of that. But we are now starting to see the physical effects of climate change in our communities. And when people start to see those things, whether it's extended droughts or heat waves in strange parts of the year, even in Los Angeles, people don't think we necessarily have seasons, but there's enough seasonality that when it's 95 degrees in December, people pay attention to that, and they recognize that something is different from how it used to be. And heat kills just as much as air pollution kills. We've seen heat episodes in Europe and elsewhere where hundreds of people have died. LA is built now anyway, in some cases retrofitted for a warm environment, so everybody or most people have air conditioning, again, except those disadvantaged communities. And this is another part of the work that we're now doing in the county of Los Angeles, where we have to identify who are vulnerable to the future changes that climate change is going to bring. And how do we start to retrofit or manage our communities to be resilient to the changes that are coming? And we've talked about things like more cooling centers and reverse 911, so that people who and shuttle or dial a ride or even shared ride services like Lyft and Uber being purposed for the reason for getting people from unair conditioned homes and apartments into cooling centers when the need arises.
Let's circle back now to your career, and you mentioned that it was a bit of a circuitous path. You didn't follow science or law. You took sort of a different route to the work that you do, and you've done a fair range of work in the environmental space. Can you just walk us briefly through what your path has been?
Yeah, well, I knew I wanted to work in government. This coming out of my master's degree, which was in effect in public policy, although it was called social policy in the United Kingdom. I knew that I wanted to work in government. I felt that government could have an impact, and I wanted to be in an impactful place. And it was, I got out of school at a time when jobs were not plentiful, and I took the first real job I could get, which was in a small city here in Los Angeles County, a city of about 35,000 people. And ostensibly the job was kind of an entry-level analyst and handling some of their grant programs, but I really twisted the job as much as I could to serve the environment. So this was a beach community. And this was 1987, 88 time period, well before laws around recycling, before the mandates. And I instituted an on-beach recycling program that, we had a second can put out, and the lid of that can was sized so that only bottles and cans could fit, and it was, we started to recycle on the beach. But that moved me into I wanted to get out of the small city and into the big city. So I went on to the city of Los Angeles. under then Mayor Tom Bradley, who was really great and a visionary. And not long after I arrived in the city of Los Angeles, the mayor had proposed creating an environment department, a department within the city structure dedicated to the environment. And as soon as the general manager of that department was named, I was on the phone with her and sending her. This was at the advent of email, but sending her emails. I was looking for a job. And I was one of the first employees hired, and so really got to build a new city department from the ground up, focused on environmental issues, and really seeing environmental policy crafted at the fine detailed level. And I worked my way up there to be the assistant general manager, and then had an opportunity to move to the city of Los Angeles's electric and water utility, the LADWP, to run their renewable energy and energy efficiency and tree planting and distributed generation and electric vehicles. And it was a tough decision for me because I loved the policy work. And the DWP work was not policy work, it was implementation. And I had not in my career, other than perhaps that early experience in putting out recycling containers at the beach, I had not really tried to implement the policy itself. And I wanted the challenge and the intellectual growth that would have come with taking on implementation. And it was a time when the DWP had really created, quite honestly, a mess with its solar PV incentive program for residential customers. It had offered such generous rebates that it had a several thousand people waiting list of people trying to get the rebate, and they had shut down the program and stopped providing any rebates. And so part of my job was to come in and redesign the program and clear that waiting list. And that was all, good and interesting. And I went from managing the city's environment department was all of 20, 25 people. I went from that to managing several hundred people working, to deliver energy efficiency and all the other services that we provided. And so it really helped me grow as not just as a person, but as a manager, because now I had to manage a large group, and I really had to learn how to delegate. And it really taught me the value of properly designed policy, because when you have to go to implementation, you've got to have a policy that actually can be implemented. And so that was a unique and really stimulating experience, and I learned a lot there. And it's one of those, it's in a kind of a strange circumstance that I ended up leaving LADWP. I was, after several years of that, and after having fixed the program, I wanted to have a quieter job. I wanted to go back to being an analyst, if you will, and I had known of the California Climate Action Registry. I had gotten the city of Los Angeles and ultimately LADWP to be among the first members of that registry. So we were kind of founding members. And I had always attended their annual gatherings, and I was at one of their annual gatherings, and it's a long story how I got there, but it's one of those things where sometimes you're good and sometimes you're lucky, and I was just lucky to be in the right place at the right time, and I almost wasn't, because the conference was over and I was with my wife, and we were just going to go back to our own hotel. And I said, let me go back into the conference space and just do one more sort of walk around to see if there's anybody else I need to talk to. And sure enough, I talked to the person who said, Diane is looking for somebody just like you. Go talk to her right now. And I had a job offer within a week.
That's incredible. I like that that final sweep through the conference floor. It's something that I've experienced as well. You're tired. The conference is over. You're kind of done networking. but there's always
Right.
more people to meet.
And then from there,
Yeah.
so I
So
and that was
mhm.
so I actually took a job with the California Climate Action Registry to write their local government protocol. Here's the local government guy, right? And I was going to be just their local government
Mhm.
liaison. And then within a matter of a couple of weeks, two of the senior staff had decided to go off. One to medical school. One took a job elsewhere, and then Diane was creating something brand new called the Climate Registry. And so instead of taking a small analyst job to be the local government liaison, I was asked, in effect, if I would be willing to, one, be the executive vice president with the knowledge that there would be this transition and Diane Wittenberg would go off and run the climate registry. And I would then compete for and be on the interim for the executive director of the California Climate Action Registry at a time when it needed a complete strategic revamping. And so I had the opportunity to work with the board of directors to rethink what the California Climate Action Registry should be post split or creation of the climate registry. And we created this whole offsets piece and renamed it and rebranded it and expanded it across North America. And I ran that organization for 9 years before eventually needing a break and taking almost a year off and traveling and surfing and writing and reading, and was approached ultimately to be the first chief sustainability officer for the county of Los Angeles, where the county felt like it needed to have some regional vision and approach around sustainability. And I was fortunate enough to come with a skill set and a vision for what the office could and should do, that the Board of Supervisors hired me to be in the position I currently am.
And it's sort of a full circle opportunity for you, right? I mean, you're working with how many cities
Yeah,
are
there's
encompassed by the
88
county of
cities
LA?
in the county of Los Angeles, and it is full circle in the sense that the vast majority of those cities are like the first city I started with. Once you've removed the city of Los Angeles from the equation, it's about 40% of the county's population, and then there's about a million people, or 10% of the county's population in what's called the unincorporated areas. That leaves 5 million people to be distributed among the remaining 87 cities. So the average size of a city in Los Angeles is between 50 and 60,000 people. And to me, this was the interesting and unique challenge that I thought this job had, and that I could grapple with here. If I were being brought in just to make sure that the county's fleets and facilities were as green as could be, that wouldn't have been an interesting challenge for me, or if it was really just to be focused on the million people that we have direct land use authority over in the unincorporated areas. But what I said to the board as I was being interviewed was, these are not local, or these are regional problems, and they need regional solutions. And the county of Los Angeles has the technical capacity and the resources to help those 88 cities, those small cities that can't do it themselves. And of course, we've got cities that take leadership. We've got the city of Santa Monica, that is a shining example of how you address sustainability, and the city of LA has done a great job with its Sustain LA plan. And there's a couple of others that have been working on these issues. But the vast majority of cities in LA County don't have climate plans even. I think there's a dozen cities with climate plans out of those 12. So we've got a long way to go. And to me, what's really interesting is how we can work together with cities to craft truly regional strategies and solutions to the sustainability challenges that we face.
So is your work then sort of back in the policy realm, helping these cities craft their strategies? as well as the county strategy, or is
Yeah,
there
it very
implementation
much is in the
as
policy
well?
realm. And this is kind of the distinction I make in terms of how I view sustainability. And it is a little bit different perspective than others bring, and maybe my own personal experience and bias. But it's also shared by the office in which I sit. I am in the chief executive office of the County of Los Angeles. And like any chief executive office, they don't do anything. And what I mean by that is that, we don't implement in the chief executive office. We have 400 budget analysts who, make sure that the county is running properly. And so the perspective I bring is that for sustainability, one, it has to include the three E's in absolutely co-equal measure. So equity is absolutely vital, and especially in a county like Los Angeles, with the diversity that we have and the economic disparities that we have and the disproportionate environmental impacts that our communities suffer. If you look at the Cal Enviro screen, the vast majority, I think half of the tracks that are in the Cal Enviro screen as disadvantaged are in Southern California, and most of those in Los Angeles County. So equity is absolutely critical, but so is economy. I come from an economic perspective, and I think we need. You can't have a sustainable community. You can't have a sustainable society if people aren't gainfully employed in good jobs, and I think we have to push that one as well. So, and it's not just. I mean, I'm all for green jobs, however you might define those. But we think that you need to push jobs in general, and so we're crafting now. Our job here is to craft a regional sustainability plan across all of the categories of sustainability. That really is the planning and policy document that sets the long-term vision and goals for where we want this region to be over the course of the next 30 years, by 2050, but with interim milestones, of course, as well. We've got, we'll have 2035 goals. And of course, we're going to be hosting the Olympics in 2028 here in Los Angeles. And I'm part of the sustainability committee that's advising those Olympics. They're going to be the first net zero energy, carbon neutral Olympics in history. And we're hoping that we can get everybody to every event through zero emission transportation. At least that's our big, hairy, audacious goal. So we do have these interim goals, but what we're going to do is really set a vision and policy for the region, and then leave it to others and encourage others and help others on the implementation side.
So you mentioned economy and jobs as being one of the three central pillars, one of the three E's. I want to talk a little bit specifically about green jobs and sustainability jobs. Your career has gone from working with a couple cities, working with what I think is the largest
It
public
is.
utility in the U.S., working with the largest carbon offsets registry, and really understanding what goes into project development, and as well as sort of the financial machinations around the carbon markets, and then back to this birth where you have purview of big number of cities and many millions of people. Um, you know, what do you see now and evolving, particularly in LA County, in terms of job opportunities?
Yeah, well,
What is there for
there,
people?
the LA is unique in terms of, I think, its economy. Of course, we're famous for the film industry, but in film and television. But that is not the sole or primary driver of our economic activity. We are actually quite a large manufacturing hub still. And I think, interestingly, none of the Fortune 50, I don't even think any of the Fortune 100 are located in Los Angeles County. So we're not concentrated in any way. in one sector, we're not a particular company town. We're a little bit of everything. We're a huge textile manufacturing, area. We've got a lot of wind and energy or solar energy companies here. I just came actually before this conversation from a discussion around manufacturing for zero emission vehicle technology, and where is the manufacturing going to occur? How do we encourage it here in California, and from my perspective in Los Angeles? And I found out that there's one of the largest manufacturers of EV chargers has a facility here in Los Angeles. We've got a couple of electric bus manufacturers who have located facilities here in Los Angeles. And so there's good jobs across the spectrum, working class, stable, good benefits kind of manufacturing jobs, but also all the way up to the sorts of intellectual capital think jobs that you might have. This is the Rand Institute is here in Los Angeles, and they do a lot of good thinking around these issues. And of course, we've got the countless major universities: USC, UCLA, Occidental. I could go on. So what's interesting, I think, from in a city's perspective is, or a regional perspective is that we are, we're all the way across the board, and I think that reflects just the scale and size of Los Angeles with its 10 million people, and economy that, if we were a country, would be in a G20. So when you think about a place like the LA region, you're not focused on one particular area, but it's across the board in terms of what's available in both the brown economy, if you will, although we're trying to discourage brown or toxic uses, and really pushing the green economy. But I'll give you an example. Actually, this is one of the initiatives that we're really proud of and working hard on. Is we've got parts of the county where, for historic legacy reasons, we've got auto dismantlers, metal finishers, other unpleasant uses and polluting uses, literally side by side with residential properties and with schools. And that would never occur under zoning law today, but these are legacy uses, and probably, quite honestly, driven by racism, in terms of, well, that's okay there. And as we think about how do we clean up those areas, we certainly we have strong land use and zoning authority. We can down zone economic uses so that you can't have that kind of manufacturing. But we also want to maintain the job base. It's critical that while we're cleaning up industries and disincentivizing certain kinds of industries, we incentivize others so that we maintain a stable job base. So we're looking at, what are appropriate clean industry uses in some of these facilities. And, maybe you can replace a battery manufacturer with a food processing plant, or food preparation, and so those are the kinds of things we're looking at. And this is going to be tough, but building a green economy is going to require that we attack just as we started the conversation today with, how you attack air pollution. You have to break it into its individual components, and then you have to have strategies for each of those.
I know that you talk to people probably as often as I do who are either starting careers in sustainability or transitioning from more traditional industries. How do you advise them? I mean, because what you just described is partly traditional industries in transition, It's partly pure plays, like electric vehicles, for example. Um, it's partly policy. It's, when we talk about green jobs, it's such a huge range. And obviously it depends on the person, but is there any sort of general advice that you give to people who are particularly looking
Yeah,
at the field
I do
in the
get,
LA area?
and I'm always happy to talk to people. So when I get an email or a message on LinkedIn or even a phone call from somebody, and they say, would you be willing to talk to me about career opportunities? I'm always happy to do that. And I was fortunate enough to have people who did that for me when I was coming up. Um, and what I usually say is, that if you have to really examine yourself and your motivation and what you're most interested in, because it is such a wide open field. There are people who are absolutely passionate about recycling and the elimination of single-use plastics that are going into the waste stream. And if that's your passion, then pursue that. Or there are people who really are bike advocates and active transportation advocates, and then there's people who are open space advocates. And so you really, before when I'm approached and I say, well, what interests you? And sometimes I do get a response like, "Oh, I want to protect the environment, and I think climate change is important." And I agree; those are laudatory goals. But then you really do need to start to break down what your passion is within that broad rubric, because to solve climate change is not a single strategy. It's, as the saying goes, a silver buckshot. There's 100 strategies to attack it. And so think about what drives you and
Right.
what you're passionate about, but then also what skills you bring, because there are different skill sets in different parts of the green economy. You may be, there's a woman I'm familiar with who had a career in the film and television business, and at a point decided, you know what, that's no longer exciting me. It's no longer passionate to me. This climate change thing has gotten out of control. I want to get working, and what do I do? And I talked to her a couple of years ago when she was first making that transition. And I said kind of the same things that I just said here, which is, examine what you're good at and what you're interested in. She, as a person who was, in production in film, is good at just getting stuff done. It's like something needs to get done, and it needs to get done right now in order to keep the production
Mm-hmm.
on schedule. And so she knows that's a skill set she brings, and she's really fascinated by, to the point of deep wonkiness of the energy sector and how electricity is generated and stored and transported and used. And so she managed to use those skills and that passion to find something at LADWP, a small project that she could hook on to, and she was very successful in that. And then, as I was building here in Los Angeles, our community choice aggregation program, I reached out to her because I knew she was a person who could just help me. This was essentially startup mode, who could just help me with a little bit of anything. And she now is the sustainability director for USC, and has really completely changed her career. And it really it goes back to those two fundamentals that I mentioned. One, what are you good at? Two, what are you really interested in, and then how can you marry those two things?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And um, a point I just want to underscore is that, uh, as was the case with you, and as was the case with the woman you just described, it's not just technical work. It's not obviously there's lots of work for engineers and science, and also there is work for people who can get the job done, who are good at managing projects. There are jobs for folks with liberal arts backgrounds and are good communicators.
That's absolutely.
So there's
I
a lot that
definitely
needs to
agree
be
with
done.
that, and we need
Just
all the scientists and engineers we can get. And talking today at this panel with the
absolutely.
manufacturers of zero emission, we've got a workforce deficit just in sort of manufacturing jobs. But beyond that, there's lots of room for people who have more, liberal arts, communications, literature. I mean, what we're really looking for are people who can think, who are analytical, who can write, and who can communicate.
So we talked a little while ago about kind of why you are doing this work, or why you started down the path, and LA's horrible air quality when you were growing up, kind of combined with the environmental movement that you became aware of through Earth Day and other venues. What's inspiring you now, or maybe more specifically,
Yeah,
who do
and
you draw
I'm
inspiration
glad you
from
brought
in
it
your work?
back because my own view and vision on the environment has changed over time, as I think the environmental movement has begun to change. And what really inspires me now, when I think about the environmental movement, are the folks who are really living it on the front line, still dealing with the kinds of air pollution problems that I grew up with, and some people would say LA has solved, but we've got horrible localized air pollution issues in LA County. Largely around the port and around goods movement, the trucks, the diesel particulate that comes out of those trucks. And this is in disadvantaged communities. I talked about this a little bit. And there are people that are organizing at the grassroots level who are demanding that they not be left behind as part of this movement. And as I go back to that view of the beautiful blue marble floating in the ether, I I almost reject the point of view I had then, because it's not the planet that I'm worried about. It's the people who live on the planet, and it's their experiences on a day-to-day basis. And so, who inspires me are the people who are really leading what I think is the next iteration of the environmental movement. The environmental justice folks, the equity advocates, the public health advocates. And this is where I really am now so impassioned that this has got to be our solution, and not that we can't or shouldn't be dealing with the big issues, the slow violence, as I said, of climate change. But there are people whose kids are kept out of school because they have asthma, and then who start to fall behind in grades, and their parents have to come home from work and they don't earn a paycheck that day. For whom the physical environment still is a barrier to success, to achievement, to just achieving a standard of living that we all anywhere aspire to. And so that's what's driving me, and it's those heroes in organizations like Communities for a Better Environment, or SCOPE, or East Yard's Community for Environmental Justice. That's and they're not big names, and they may not be, they're not writing books necessarily. But they're inspiring in their passion for this work, and the need for us to solve all of our problems in a holistic way. That we stop piecemealing our approaches to these issues, and we really think about putting air pollution and climate change, and whatever else it happens to be, park space in where places are park poor, and community safety all together into a package.
It's a pretty grounded and down to earth, if you'll forgive the pun, perspective. I mean, especially after having done a lot of kind of far-reaching international work over the last few years. So, just thinking about your trajectory and your career, can you just single out maybe um, a time when things weren't going so well, a major setback or challenge, and then flipping that on its head, what are you
Yeah,
most
well, I
proud
can
of
tell
in the
you
work that you've done?
a story of a time that probably one of the low points of my career, anyway. But certainly, fortunately for me, became a positive learning lesson. I was an analyst, as I said, in the city of Los Angeles. This was before I'd become the assistant general manager, or even the air quality director for the city of LA's environment department. But I started off there essentially as a legislative policy analyst. And there was a council office that had heard about the destruction of the rainforests in the Amazons and elsewhere, and said this is, of course, this was the early '90s, and this was starting to become an awareness in the environmental community. And I think Ben and Jerry's at this time, created their rainforest crunch as a way of trying to protect the existing forest. And so this council member wanted us to no longer purchase tropical hardwoods as a city. Just said, let's do an inventory of where we use tropical hardwoods and let's just find replacements. And so it was my job to craft that policy and to come back with a recommendation and an ordinance on how we would change our own purchasing policies in Los Angeles. And as as a diligent analyst, got out there and started talking to rainforest advocates, I quickly learned that they weren't advocating these kinds of policies, that not providing economic value to the forest only further accelerates the destruction of the forest, because people want to make money on their land, and if they can't sell the wood, then they're going to burn it down. Quite honestly, is how they deforest in Brazil. It's not like they do some harvesting, but in many cases they just burn the thing down so they can start over and plant soybeans or graze cattle. So they really said you need to have a policy that only purchases sustainably harvested woods. And at that time, something called the Forest Stewardship Council was starting up, and so the Forest Stewardship Council certified hardwoods coming out of tropical forests that were being sustainably managed. And so I like, wow, I found the answer, and I crafted up my report back to the city council, and had the big hearing day at the environmental quality committee, and presented my findings. And I think the phrase is, I had my head handed to me. This was not what the council member wanted. And didn't understand why I was recommending what I was doing. And I had not, what I had failed to do, I'd done all the analytical work correctly, but what I had failed to do was to build a coalition of support for the policy recommendations I was making. I had not reached out. I'd reached out to the rainforest advocates, but they were not here in Los Angeles. I was talking to people in San Francisco and in Brazil and elsewhere. I had not built a coalition of the local environmental community here in Los Angeles. I hadn't brought them up to speed. I hadn't brought up our own internal folks in our purchasing department and our city architect's office and elsewhere. And so I was kind of the lone voice for what was ultimately the right policy, but presented in the wrong way. And in fact, the city architect was in the chamber that day because he had an item on the agenda after mine, and he stood up and said, "That's crazy. We should just stop buying that stuff." So what I learned is that you can do all the good analytical work that you need to do, but really to get things done anywhere, and this is true, in the public sector as much as it is in the private sector, is you really need partners, you need people, you need coalitions. And this is maybe sound a little corny, but there's an old African proverb. I hope I can get it correctly because I haven't said it in I don't know how long. But I think it goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And that was the lesson that I learned from that. And after that, I was very good about building coalitions, and I think I've gone far because in my career, and I think I've moved policy because I've learned that it takes everyone working towards the same end, and that's a slower process.
Sort of the flip side of that question, in a long career that you've had, what stands out as being something that you're
You know,
particularly proud of?
there are professional accomplishments, of course, and I think the work that we did at the Climate Action Reserve to rethink what that organization could be, and then to build it into something successful is a certainly pride, a point of pride for me. And when our protocols were adopted by the California Air Resources Board, which is the best air quality regulatory agency in the world, when they accepted the work that we had done as regulatory quality, and then ultimately accepted our organization to help manage that component of the offsets piece of the cap and trade program, that was immensely gratifying. But that's not where I'm really proudest. I think where I'm really proudest is in the people that I've worked with, and the relationships that I've built, and the mentoring that I've been able to do, and the bringing people up into this realm. And it was, this is actually, this goes back to the other question. I was always a bit disappointed that I wasn't able to bring as much diversity to the Climate Action Reserve as I would have liked, and I take full responsibility and blame for that. But I'm as you can tell from my previous answer, I'm deeply committed to these issues, and it's not diversity for diversity's sake. It's diversity to really help drive equity. And so I've committed now in the work that I'm doing, clearly as from externally facing, but even as I build a team here within the county, that is a critical goal for me, is to bring up underrepresented communities in the environmental field, because the environmental field is changing, and my view of the environment is changing, and I think we need a new generation of leaders behind ours that reflect the diversity of the communities that we represent.
I'm really glad to hear you talk about that. I think I know empirically, because I've seen the data, that the environmental field does a really bad job with diversity. It's pretty good with gender, except in leadership positions, and it's a bit behind there. Although interestingly, women, I think, make up close to 60% of environmental
Interesting.
foundation chairmanships. But organization level, executive directors, it's much lower, but it's largely white. And you're right, it absolutely needs to change. I think both from an equity perspective, but also uh, to get it right. Right. I mean, it's sort of a single lens that we're viewing strategy, and clearly what we're
Right.
doing isn't working, or it's not working fast enough, or maybe to your point before, the coalition hasn't been broad enough to go
That's
as far as we need to. And I think that's probably exactly the point. So looking forward, and maybe just to end on this, where do we go from here? Gary, you and I were together at the signing of the Paris Agreement, and it was a high point of my shorter career in doing this work. But of course, the current administration is undoing that. The closer we get to the local level, talking about the work that you're doing, certainly the work that is being done across California and some other states, there are reasons to be hopeful. But where do you see the most exciting opportunities out there? Where do you see the biggest chance for
Yeah, well,
impact
I think
to
we
be made?
are on the cusp of a real energy and transportation revolution, particularly here in California. Um, because we've put the policies in place, the regulations, the programs, the incentives to really drive towards a zero emission energy sector and ultimately a zero emission transportation sector. And that revolution is on its way, and I can hear the drum beats out there. I'm part of it, of course, and as I said, I've been just came from something that was very much topically focused on that. And so I think where we go is, we go do the work. We put our noses down, or to kind of take a Zen cone or something. We keep chopping wood and carrying water, because we're gonna get this done. But we need to just stay grounded, stay focused, keep doing the work, and do it in the places where it's going to matter. And that could be, again, that could be the energy sector, if that's what your passion is, or that could be transportation, or it could be diesel particulates from freight that's impacting your community and your child's ability to breathe. But where we go, I think we've made a lot of progress. We haven't solved the problems. We don't have rivers catching fire anymore, so that's a good thing. But we've got some lofty goals ahead of us, and we just need to get to work.
Well, great. Well, Gary, thanks so much for taking time with me today, and thanks for all the work that you do.
Well, thank you, David. I really appreciated the opportunity and the conversation. It was interesting, and it was kind of a trip down memory lane too. So that's always fun. And I hope to see you in Paris or somewhere else soon.
The Sustainability Leaders Podcast is a resource of Jobs with Impact. Our engineer and associate producer is Ian Swanke. Theme music is also by Ian Swanke. I'm David Rosenheim. If you like the show, please rate and review us on iTunes or your preferred platform. And be sure to tell your friends and colleagues who want to make a difference. Thanks for listening. See you next week.